Whether it's a true sequel, a spiritual successor, or just loosely inspired by, following up on any form of work is such a weird thing to do, especially when it comes to the creator's point of view. I mean, you've got so many people looking at you, expecting you to hit it off the same way you did with your first game, your first video, or whatever medium you favor, to perfectly recapture that spark that made them look at your stuff and go, whoa, that's cool. Though realistically, it's a pretty hard prospect to grasp with. Some folks prefer to play it safe, to make stuff that feels similar to what they've already done, and I totally get that. Personally, I'd worry that it would run the risk of feeling like I'm rehashing stuff, repeating myself, or running out of ideas. On the other hand, if you try pushing the envelope too much, you can easily alienate a big part of your target audience. Because there's a ton of people who get mad uncomfy when any sort of developer or artist wants to try something new, something out there to keep their own creative juices flowing, to try and innovate, to keep on pushing their medium one step forward in an interesting manner. And while having all those eyes on you can become this pretty intoxicating feeling, it's also one that comes with its fair share of weirdness and unnecessary stress tied to it. The weight of those expectations on your shoulders as you work the night away in your cramped office, looking at the clock every now and then and just wondering to yourself, will it come out on time? Will it be okay? Will people even vibe with it? And I hate to say it like that because it does give off some big glorified doomer vibes. But in a way, it also made me realize that maybe there really is no sense in overthinking it. No matter what's your approach to things, there's always going to be some folks to complain about this or that. So why not do it your own way? I like to set the ambiance with some long intros. My mannerisms and speech patterns weird some folks out, for sure. But what truly matters is that they're mine, and that's what makes each video feel special. Cause in the end, all you can really do to stand out is your best. Pour yourself entirely into what you believe in, and hope that some folks will resonate with it the same way you did. Or at least close enough. That sort of creativity, of willingness to experiment and get weird with it has always been a huge inspiration for me. And it's through those same exact feelings that I got to experience some of my favorite pieces of art out there. Some games that I wouldn't have gotten to play if it weren't from some developers deciding one day to just go absolutely ballistic on that shit. It's how I got to experience Suda51's entire body of work, or even begin to understand his general design ethos, one that's nearly 3 decades in the making now. I've already talked to great lengths about him and his design philosophy in both the Killer 7 and Silvercase videos, so I won't bore you with the same old minutia. But basically, with every new release, the man's been doing what he does best, perfecting his craft without compromising his artistic vision, in a way that feels entirely his. I'd lie if I said that shit wasn't what's keeping me going some of those days. And it's also why today, I want to talk about one of his stranger outings in the video game landscape. One that maybe didn't get all the love his other stuff seems to get. A game by the poetic name of Flower, Sun and Rain. A title that would confuse yet captivate my attention for years, and why it matters so much not only in relation to his entire Kill the Past series, but also to the medium of video games as a whole. And I know that's some mighty big words to hype up a game like that, but trust me when I say, it was worth it the entire way through. While never being advertised as an outright sequel to the Silvercase, Flower, Sun and Rain feels way too important to its lineage to just dismiss it as that one weird side story. Even though I love the 25th Ward like nothing else, I see a lot of folks calling it the real sequel to the Silvercase in huge quotation marks, and I don't exactly fuck with that. A lot of its themes and ideas obviously tie into each other, but it's also relying heavily on the information you gain from playing both of its predecessors, in its thematic approach, but also in how it brings back characters or concepts they introduced there, for reasons I won't spoil yet, so instead let's get back to basics. Directed by the ultimate symbol of style, Suda Goichi, Flower, Sun and Rain is an adventure game for the Nintendo DS, released around the world in 2008. Its initial premise is deceptively simple, but the more you play, the more you realize that things aren't always what they seem to be. The game opens up with its protagonist driving all cozy on the highway. This time not Sumio Toba, nor Sumio Kodai, but instead Sumio Mondo, this swanky ass guy wearing a full suit smack dab in the middle of summer. On his way, monologuing to himself, but most importantly to you, the player. He explains that he's a searcher by trade, and that by using his computer briefcase, aptly named Catherine, he can find anything that's lost. Though today, he's on his way to Lost Pass Island with a very specific goal in mind. He's been hired by a certain mystery man for a mission he has yet to know the details of. Over the course of the fairly modest opening chapter, Mondo arrives at the titular Hotel Flower Sun and Rain, where the bulk of the game takes place, and proceeds to meet up with his client, the ever-so elusive Edo McAllister, the hotel manager who you might recognize from Killer 7. This time though, he's not holding back whatsoever, ditching entirely his vague and cryptic-ass dialogue. Instead, the dude just straight up drops on your head this absolute bombshell of a reveal. A terrorist is targeting the island and managed to place a bomb on a plane leaving from Los Pass Airport. So your job is to find that bomb before the plane takes off. However, right before you leave, homie makes sure to press the fact that this island, and I quote, is home to a magnetic field that causes time to repeat on forever and ever. As you'd expect from anything Suda's ever touched, the game doesn't pull back any punches. On his first day at the hotel, Mondo finds himself locked into a room/paranormal phenomena called the Seal Space by a mischievous ghost. By the time he actively manages to deal with the issue, using both his wits but also with the help of one of the hotel's maids staring at him from a peephole, he finds himself looking at the sky, seeing the plane he was supposed to catch fly above and explode right in front of his very eyes. Though strangely enough, just after that, Mondo finds himself waking up once more on his first day at the resort and is instructed once again to prevent the bomb from exploding. Flower Sun and Rain operates on this Groundhog Day-like scenario, but not exactly. Each day is the same but different. Each day is the same but different. Each day is the same but different. Each day is the same but never the same, you feel? Mondo finds himself having to solve puzzle after puzzle, with each chapter allowing you, slowly but surely, to get one step closer to that fated airport. Meanwhile, at the end of each scenario, completely parallel to Sumio's ever-increasingly weird shenanigans, we find Toriko Kusabi and witness her adventures with her pink pet alligator, Christina. So your cozy Japanese adventure game, visual novel-y mystery vibes slowly devolve into this everlasting one-day mystery, with Sumio stuck in the middle of it, confused as to whatever's going on around him. It's like the entire game makes it a goal to constantly subvert your expectations and purposefully toys with them. Every time you're convinced the story's gonna head one way, it just swerves the hell out and hits you in the back of the head with some of the juiciest plot twists. For real, I don't think there's anyone who went to this game knowing what was gonna unfold by the end of it. And to add even more to that mystery comes bits of its development history. For someone who likes to rant and rave all the time about all sorts of niche and obscure Japan-exclusive hidden gems, it's kind of funny to talk about something that actually factually made its way over here, though not without some form of lost in translation type of beat. You see, Flower Sun and Rain originally came out for the PS2 in 2001, but never saw release outside of Japan. Similarly to the Silver Case, it wasn't until years after its launch that we Westerners got to experience it fully translated. FSR's lack of localization can be explained by multiple reasons. Its overall niche appeal, its status as a sequel to another Japan-exclusive title we wouldn't get for years, or even just the intrinsic difficulty that came from having to translate all of Suda's trademark writing. It's all stuff that contributed heavily in us not getting the game for over half a decade. That and maybe a certain happenstance in September of 2001? Cause yeah, having a plot that talks about terrorist attacks and bombs stuck to planes probably wasn't gonna get launched to the international market, especially around that time. Once we finally did get the title overseas, it did come at the cost of everything being bit crushed to shit. So while the game defo blasted my corneas with some of the most interesting visuals and storytelling on the console, it didn't hit me as hard as it could've or does nowadays. Cause by all means, Flower Sun and Rain is an excellent game, but it can feel pretty lacking without the context offered from its development, and especially from its predecessor. As an impressionable child coming straight out of like Pokemon Diamond and Dragon Quest Heroes Rocket Slime, I just couldn't grasp with the intricacies the game offered me. Literally didn't get it at all, sat there wondering the entire time why I had to run around everywhere, solving math puzzles, and almost immediately bounced off of it. It took actual years for me to pick it back up, but man was it worth it. After playing through a ton of Suda's prior works, but most importantly the Silver Case, I slowly came to realize that Flower Sun and Rain was perfect as a sequel, but also in its own weird way. And in turn, that made the game rise quickly among some of my favorite titles altogether. It's one of those games that has hella to offer and hits all the right spots for me. Gameplay-wise though, Flower Sun and Rain uses perfectly what Grasshopper Manufacture learned from their previous projects, and goes full on with it. Its world innovates onto the Twilight and Moonlight Syndrome format, by giving you that same sense of exploration, but this time in a fully 3D environment that you can navigate at your own leisure. The game was initially meant to use the same film window engine devised for the Silver Case, but the whole idea had to be scrapped in favor of realizing that more free-formed feeling vision of a tropical resort. One where you can talk to characters, examine objects, and enjoy the island's sunny rays of good vibes. Though despite the game allowing you that freedom to explore, the overall plot progression is fairly linear, all things considered. There's usually only really one thing you can examine at a time, and areas that are deemed unnecessary for the plot are closed off depending on the chapter, most of the time in pretty comedic ways. The majority of your interactions will instead come in the form of puzzles that Sumio has to solve, using his wits, but also his computer briefcase. Catherine can be jacked into various objects or even characters, and when doing so, you'll always be tasked with entering a code. The majority of those puzzles are solved by locating said code within an in-game guidebook known as the Lost Pass, which is given to you pretty early on. The game makes it very clear that if ever in doubt, you should check it out, and I can't help but recommend the same thing. Pretty much every solution is spelled out in that thing. All you have to do realistically is comb through page 1 to 49, though maybe not in one go, yeah? Because that's a lot of exposition to go through. And I get it, if you're coming exclusively from Suda's more action-packed stuff like Killer 7 or No More Heroes, all this stuff probably looks obsolete at worst and nebulous at best. But trust me, it's actually really fun. There's a certain spark of genius, that sort of eureka factor that comes in when you realize what the game's asking of you. When you find the solution to a puzzle because you remember that on page 12 you spotted a picture that fits perfectly the scenario you're decoding, codes of which are almost always in the forms of number tangentially or directly related to the object Catherine's plugged into. So it's not like you're just supposed to be guessing that shit at random. Though there's definitely some stuff that won't hesitate to push your shit in. Like near the very end of the game where all of a sudden they just tell you to do some quick math and whip out that good old calculator. Most of the time you can get some pretty straightforward hints as to what page you should be looking for by talking to other characters, and it all feels very self-intuitive. Except maybe the lost and found puzzles that were added with the DS version. Basically, every day you get a list of 3 items you can find across the resort, and their codes are found through purely math-based operations. You know how it be. I am but a simple jester, dumb of brain and thick of ass. Honestly, they're pretty much the sole reason why I didn't vibe with the game in the first place. Cause unlike the plot-relevant puzzles, those are more akin to complex equations and riddles using math as a conduit, rather than like, looking in the guidebook for a certain series of number. Good thing is, they're completely optional, and don't really do much besides unlocking extra costumes once you've beaten the game. So you know, that's something appropriate for the completionist folks out there. In a way, Flower Sun and Rain's math-based puzzles could be seen as the mirror to the Silver Case's more textual nature. Not that FSR does away with the text, oh no, quite the opposite. Our boy Suda loves to write, and man does he know how. Having that contrast present though was apparently super important for him, and I totally get why. Following the first few iterations of his Kill the Past design philosophy, the team at Grasshopper Manufacturers set out to make their next endeavor as distinct as possible from their previous outing. Right from the start, Flower Sun and Rain was designed purposefully to serve as the yin to Silver Case's yang. While the latter would boast its detective stories, murder cases, and deep character introspectives and a ton of hyper-sleek yet oppressive as fuck cityscapes, FSR's plot would instead be prominently featured in this cozy, tropical paradise. You could say both of these would be games who breathe the modern air of their respective times, true products of their social environment. Yet, despite the changing times and settings, the sequel would still be iterating onto its predecessor's subject matters, just in its own way. The original idea was to have that one-day mystery happen exclusively at the airport, though a counter-proposal came in from the publishers at ASCII with the idea of using a hotel resort as the setting. Suda, cheeky fucker that he always was, decided to fill the distance between both locations and make each of them pivotal parts of the game's setting, effectively pleasing both sides, but also making it the tropical paradise we now know as Lost Pass Island. During production, Grasshopper Manufacture began to expand from its small and reserved 10-people team to a total of 15 by the end of development, including most notably the addition of Akira Ueda of Moon Remix RPG Adventure fame. this time tasked to illustrate the background art for Flower Sun and Rain. His experience working on fantasy games like Seiken Densetsu and Super Mario RPG most likely had a huge influence on giving Lost Pass Island its mystical, effervescent art direction, in turn making it into this extremely colorful paradise separate from the mundanities of real life. And while the DS port might have compressed the scenery into absolute crust territory, the vibes remain everlasting. Legit, there's so much charm throughout the entire game, and its idyllic summer aesthetic is just scratching the surface. Cause yeah, everywhere you go, the brightness of the sun is never too far away. The warm sand glistening as you walk down stretches of highway, all while jamming to the game's iconic beats. But beating that is the sleekness of that UI. Man, there's just something to it. The way the text pops on screen whenever someone talks, the stylish as all hell character portraits in the corner, with that similar yet different take on the traditional Silvercase style. Takashi Miyamoto returned as character artist for this, and would just ever so slightly tweak his art style to match the game's lighter mood, and I feel like it works wonders. Honestly, it's really hard to look at Flower Sun and Rain and not feel some form of respect towards its commitment to presentation. Its overall look, its vibes, and the way it approaches its subject matters. It's something the Kill the Past series shares extensively. That love for style and substance working as a pair, entirely intertwined to create these everlasting experiences. The stuff that will actively stick with you for years to come. One of the most memorable aspects of Flower Sun and Rain for me was its choice of music. If it wasn't already obvious by my often unconventional choices for background tracks, I'm not exactly what you'd call an expert. By all means, I love listening to music, and having a good soundtrack is very important to my enjoyment for pretty much anything, but my overall enjoyment of music as a whole and its resulting analysis capabilities tends to be fairly limited compared to some of the folks I know. You know, there's people out there who can tell you a lot about composers, rhythm, and tempo, but that's completely out of my wheelhouse. Instead, my taste seems to rely almost entirely on a vibe-based system. I sit there and ask myself, does it fuck? And if it does, then let's go, slap that shit into the playlist, you feel? But if there's one thing I do know for sure about music, is that Masafumi Takada never fucking misses. The man's musical chops are just out of this world, practically monopolizing my heart with some of the best video game soundtracks ever composed, and Flower Sun and Rain is no different. This time though, the man's accompanied by the one and only Shingo Yasumoto, who also worked on Twilight Syndrome. Though what's even more notable to me is the fact that he actually composed the OST for Mizurna Falls, another exploration game on the PlayStation 1 who took huge inspiration from Twin Peaks. Their original compositions would be mixed into a wide array of classical music, mixing some chill as fuck house, world beat, acid jazz into songs that would be immediately memorable to anyone listening to them. This was purposely done to recreate this almost lounge-esque atmosphere for the whole resort. I really appreciate this sort of fine-tuning, catering to the game's hyper-specific vibes. They also went the extra mile and actually traveled to Thailand to record natural sounds and ambiance, something that would accompany Mondo throughout his travels and you for the entire game. And while obviously the art direction, both visually and musically speaking, feels a lot better in the PS2 release, the DS's forcefully minimalist takes on it still conveys all of its charm throughout the whole thing. Similarly, for both the original release and its port, budgetary constraints forced the team at Grasshopper to innovate in their own way. Unable to record voice acting for the entire game, they opted instead for having characters speak in these weird gibberish tones. Initially devised as some clever cost-saving measure, Suda specifically referred to that technique as the voices of a quote-unquote random foreign language, which kinda makes sense when you consider the premises the game takes place in. Of course a resort would welcome in tons of folks of diverse backgrounds and varying nationalities to live up in that place. The dialogue effectively becoming this amalgamation of random foreign languages in order to avoid the language barrier as a whole. Something you can spot all over the game's presentation and promotional material. Different languages are constantly juxtaposed and presented right next to each other. A bit like what you could see at an airport, though they defo Google translated half of that shit, cause some of those are all sorts of fucked up. While trying to get the line "object I search you," they quite literally wrote the verb to object or to deny something. But, you know, it's the intention that counts, right? I can't help but feel like it scores some semblance of extra style points in a game that is already dripping with it. style being something Flower, Sun, and Rain has more than enough to share. Not just channeled into its visuals, music, or atmosphere, but also deeply anchored in all of its tone and writing. Each chapter, each scene, and each day Sumio spends at the hotel acts as their own respective character studies. And yeah, it looks wacky as fuck on the surface, with all sorts of weirdos interrupting you on the way to the airport, folks who will constantly pester you about all sorts of nebulous requests for you to fulfill, but it becomes endearing like nothing else. Thing is, Suda's writing style is just magical in the way he can create characters and breathe life into them like nothing else. You've got this drunk woman blocking your path, smack dab in the middle of the hallway, who asks you to make cocktails for her. When you meet up with the bartender, he tells you that he actually doesn't know how to shake drinks himself, so instead you make them for him, only for the lady to absolutely hate them. Back and forth between her and the bartender for a couple more times, drink after new drink, only to learn that all this time, she was an actual, factual, real-life angel who promptly takes off right as the plane explodes in the sky once more. You've got this comedic duo stranded in the lounge because the hotel staff can't confirm their identity. So your job is to find an afro wig because one of them can't perform without wearing it. He lost his previous one aboard the boat on the way there. Said boat who can transform into a set of speakers occupying that same lounge, only for this absolute random ass scenario to end on a wholesome speech, complete with a life lesson about being too nice to people. Sumio could have easily been just a blank slate El Generico man for you to project onto. But instead, right from the start, you've got this portrayal of a man who's dead set on getting the job done, in his own weird and wacky way. The guy literally starts off by talking to you, the viewer, about how his car got a name, and will constantly monologue to you about this or that random factoid. And even though he does often act as the straight man in most situations, especially in contrast to the island stranger folks, he manages to bounce off of them so effortlessly. It makes for a scenario that keeps you coming back for more, constantly wondering what's right around the corner. Characters like a certain dancing bunny man on the highway, miles away from the hotel on his pursuit to impress the girl of his dreams. Two funky luchadors, one of which speaks exclusively like a pirate, training relentlessly in the middle of your path only for you to get drop-kicked in the head by one of them, twice. And I'm leaving out a ton of other fun folks whose daily life problems will prevent you from reaching that airport. There's so many interesting characters, and the game's format just complements them so nicely. Since each chapter only highlights a couple of them at a time, it really allows them the proper time to shine. Like Stéphane Charbonnier, this overly enthusiastic French guy constantly speaking to Sumio in cryptic riddles. Though realistically, for us the player, the man's just talking about video game terms. Triggers, flags, events, and all that shit. Every time he opens up his mouth, it's to drop some of the most wink at the camera stuff. And while it could have become increasingly annoying throughout the story, he's only there for so long that it feels refreshing enough. Motherfucker legit shows up at the last second to tell you, uh-oh, I fucked up and invented self-destructing robots you're gonna have to disarm because the game's runtime just wasn't long enough. Same thing goes for Shotaro, this annoying little brat who gets Mondo angry by constantly pointing out the game's flaws. How the character portraits don't match your 3D models, how the puzzles are dumb and convoluted, or even taunting Sumio to punch him straight in the face, because having violence towards children in your video game will change its rating and subsequently affect its sales. It really highlights that, despite being a relatively serious story, Flower, Sun, and Rain is a game about games, about the inside and the outside, the development and the final product. The end result can't help itself from being super charming. Cause you see, the fourth wall was Suda's enemy this entire time. The man said it best himself. The moment the player picks up the controller, they're inextricably intertwined to that game and its world. So why not go all out and make the dialogue self-referential and meta? Never in an overabundance, but instead in this cool and stylish way that really adds a lot of flair to each of his games. Almost as if Suda himself was trying to spoon-feed you all sorts of factoids and trivia through the screen. And while a lot of it can feel almost exclusively used for comedy's sake, the whole game acts as both a mystery story and a meta commentary on video games as a medium. Parts of the games are made purposefully tedious, asking you to go to places only to come back and forth. In a loading screen in between chapters, Edo actively hints at the fact that this chapter is going to take longer for plot purposes, since Mondo was away for quite some time before that. The purposefully tedious puzzles, almost actively serving as punchlines. Like, wow, can't believe anyone would stomach this shit. Double that with Sumio almost always complaining about doing useless side missions, only for him to do them anyway, because that's his job as a protagonist. Flower Sun and Rain is a game that aims to entertain, not only with its gameplay, but instead with the satire it derives from it, constantly pointing the finger at stuff that would be typical in your average adventure game, but putting their own unique twist to it. All of this in a game that technically came from 2001. It really shows you how Suda isn't afraid to do something completely different than the rest of his peers. Flower Sun and Rain is a game where not a single line of dialogue feels wasted. The entire game and its writing is jam-packed back to back with so much information, double meanings, and tons of fun stuff all around, all of which complements perfectly the game's mystery and twists and turns. Even in times where certain characters' dialogue can only really be understood after beating the game once or twice, or with having prior context offered from one of Suda's previous games, it's enthralling like nothing else. The bizarre atmosphere, the cryptic as fuck dialogue with tons of slang, lingo, and a vernacular specific exclusively to Suda and his crew. Even though games of its ilk don't usually have that much replay value, FSR is the type to keep each new playthrough interesting by offering you those new perspectives. It manages to be captivating no matter how many times you chuck yourself at it, and its purposefully convoluted design. So much so that the hidden meanings become almost indistinguishable from the surface level plot. They both meld into one another, and that's something more than admirable. Some of the stuff the game throws at you is just wild, with lines that take double, sometimes triple meaning after certain events. The first playthrough has this very fuck it we ball type of energy, but the more you delve into the hotel and its interconnected chains of mysteries, the more you find yourself enraptured with its cast, its atmosphere, and its story. Legit, the whole game acts as this important reminder that not every story needs to make perfect sense. Honestly, that's the least important part of a story for me. It's always been more about how it makes me feel, because I'd rather play through something that has my eyes glued to the screen regardless of context. There's so much stuff that, yeah, well, if you put it under a microscope, some of it does fall apart in a pure logical sense, and I'm sure there's folks who revel in finding those weird inconsistencies. There's always gonna be some folks who look at games like Flower Sun and Rain and its story and go, it's a mess. It is a mess, but it's a fun one. One that I love because it's unironically filled to the brim with heart and soul. It's why I fuck so much with shit like Sonic, Kingdom Hearts, or a ton of other stories that don't shy away to be themselves the entire way through, unabashedly presenting you vibes and emotions you won't get anywhere else. It's something I can't help but love out of video games as a medium, but especially Suda Goichi's games. Not that the credit goes exclusively to him, but Flower Sun and Rain is very much a Suda game. While folks like the Silver Case's Masahi Oka and Sako Kato would return to write for FSR on top of a couple additional writers, the original script didn't properly come together and become what it is today without Suda having to practically rewrite the whole thing by himself. And that's something you can notice throughout the entire game, from references to soccer, luchadors, or even punk rock. Even though Flower Sun and Rain's surface stands out from the rest of the Kill the Past series, it's very much fitting with its lineage. It's a game born of so many inspirations that it's hard to pinpoint exactly which one goes where. Suda's main drive to create the setting in the first place came from the movie The Miracle of Joe Petrol. This story about a Japanese-Filipino gangster based in Okinawa who has to flee to the Philippines after killing some local big boy yakuza. Living in the big city, young Suda kept the imagery of the less developed scenery of Okinawa and the Philippines close to his heart, going as far as to describe it as feeling like this distant, dreamlike farscape. Another inspiration was the issue number 454 of the Japanese magazine Brutus, namely an issue sporting some cool as fuck stylish English on the cover, One Island, One Resort, which in itself refers to a specific phenomenon in the Maldives archipelago, where islands have each one hotel. Suda went even further and referenced that not only in the game with the hotel in Lost Pass Island, but also in a specific issue in one of the booklets for the game's OST, once again sporting that same old poetic English, but with Suda's twist on it. One island, one resort, and one more episode. Every piece of art out there has been, and still is to some degree, derivative of some other piece of art. And while some would rather stay hush-hush about what drives them to create, maybe to instill some sense of mystery, Suda instead says fuck it and puts everything he loves into his games. The man's more than happy to wear proudly those inspirations all over his sleeve. Lots of folks love to throw the word Lynchian at anything relatively uncanny feeling or even just moderately bizarre, myself included, but FSR owes a lot of its inspiration to Twin Peaks. right in between Mizurna Falls and Deadly Premonition, it's a game that plays with the ideas of routine and life's trivialities, mundanities that keep you trapped, unable to see what's happening around you. And that's reflected both in the plot and its mystery, but also in the characters and how they act accordingly. Similarly, the plot of the game itself would also take huge inspiration from another American TV show. This time, an episode of X-Files in which Fox Mulder is killed by a suicide bomber during a bank heist, only to be forced to relive the same day over and over again. Instead of focusing on the protagonist himself, this episode's time loop revolves entirely around the banker lady who has to try her best to prevent the explosion. Thinking of it now, she probably served as inspiration for Toriko and how she closes each chapter, resetting the world day after day. It would also explain her almost guiding nature throughout the game's second act. The whole idea of having the game's puzzles center around math came to Suda when watching the Parasite Eve movie out of all things, because of a scene where two characters communicate a secret message through a numerical cipher. Even some ideas that weren't fully realized in the final product would still owe their inspiration to many sources out there, most notably with elements of design that would give the game a more action-y movie feel without resorting to showing graphic violence all the time. The game's initial proposal would even see Mondo holding a gun with only 16 bullets throughout the course of the entire game. Figuring out who or what to shoot would have been pivotal in trying to solve each case, with the final puzzle relying entirely on that one single bullet with your name on it. Later on, this evolved into Mondo carrying a Swiss Army knife with him, its multiple tools being used to solve various puzzles. This also came with the idea of a plushie containing a bomb that you could give to people to progress the plot. Actually, you can still see remnants of those concepts in the game's stylish as fuck mixed media opening, where you can spot Sumio chucking the knife in the pool and Toriko carrying around a plushie. Funnily enough, this was only scrapped because of another game released a few years prior, Suzuki Bakuhatsu, a PS1 game where a knife would also be used to disarm bombs hidden around in everyday objects. Eventually, it was decided that Mondo would use a toolbox, but that too eventually devolved into the eventual final idea. This personalized computer/briefcase who could jack into various devices to solve puzzles. Funnily enough, Catherine was named after the Catherine wheel firework, due to its rotating input system. The game's puzzles would end up being solved by inputting numbers in the Catherine's dial. It was also chosen to make the system more intuitive. Even though the prior concepts were scrapped, Suda still felt that the level of difficulty should come from the puzzles themselves instead of coming from having to deal with the interface. So the method of input was made to be similar to a real-life phone dial, an item players at the time would have been most likely familiar with. Though that's kinda something that's lost on the newer players, both now but also when the game released on the DS. Small tangent, but it's also during that phase of development that the idea of the Lost Pass tourist guide started flourishing. On top of having the guide available in the game itself, Grasshopper manufacturers set out to make it a physical item that players could take outside with them. But unlike the usual video game Prima guidebooks that contain all sorts of helpful hints and tips, they made a one-to-one replica of the in-game book itself. By virtue of hiding the puzzle solutions within that book, one could assume that Suda's goal was to extend his mixed media ambitions and to make the setting of the game the real world itself. I can go even one step further and say with absolute confidence that it was most likely intended to be this way. With the DS port of Flower, Sun, and Rain, the game would actually realize Suda's vision of a mystery you can carry with you in the outside world. While that statement originally referred to the guidebook being printed, players could now factually take the island of Lost Pass with them. Usually, I don't like going that much into development history because it can quickly devolve into 8 hours of me forcefully shoveling down trivia into your mouth, but here, the whole thing adds this very cozy extra layer to the entire experience. Even stuff that seems simple at first glance has at least some form of neat little backstory attached to them. Like the title, for example. Flower, Sun, and Rain boasts its relatively unconventional title with an imagery that naturally invokes a paradisiac summer, though it also owes its name in the first place to the short-lived Japanese band PYG, who had a song called Flower, Sun, Rain. The song apparently left a huge impact on Suda because of its feeling of nostalgia, of clinging to this pristine image of a summer past. I think that's something that can be felt throughout the entirety of the game, in all of its visual flair, but also deeply ingrained into its story. Even though the game has tons of inspirations coming from many different sources, it never really shies away from saying it, none is felt as strongly as Suda's own personal touch, an inspiration that would of course come from the past. As a part of its mixed media cross-universe, Flower, Sun, and Rain takes place in the same world as the Silver Case. While signs of this can be spotted pretty early on with familiar names popping up here and there, the game is very low-key about it and never really points it out to you. Instead, it kinda just expects you to know already, to the detriment of literally anyone who picked this up at release on the DS. But still, with the power of modern-day internet, each reveal amounts to a massive jaw drop and a sardonic smile from Suda himself. Motherfucker's been once again roping my ass throughout all of his silly little antics. The connections become more and more apparent the longer the game goes on. The guidebook mentions Sayaka Bayan and the 24th Ward. Yayoi from Moonlight Syndrome shows up as a side character out of nowhere. This couple drops mid-conversation the fact that they were both raised in the Kamui Shelter program. Remy and Yoshimitsu, two cops from the Heinous Crimes Unit, dropping on the island completely unannounced. Constant talks of Silver Eyes, bred out of hyenas specifically found on this island, only to be implemented in people. Artificial humans incubated inside a secret underground complex found underneath another completely separate island, complete with clones of major characters all over the place. Tokyo Morishima showing up in all of his trademark grumpy boy attitude, on a boat, connected to an underground maze, found on native ancient grounds? Sundance Shot, the mid to late game antagonist who first shows up in the Silver Case's manual but not in the game, who shoots Mondo in the head point blank only to get accused of being another Kamui by Toriko. Toriko, who just so happens to be Tetsugoro Kusabi's daughter, and the man himself showing up at the last fucking second to steal the entire show. Legit, the entire segment post-credit and the Kusabi reveal with the Silver Case transition screens, it just can't get better than that. The fact that time doesn't actually repeat itself on the island, and instead it was just 16 individual Sumio clones, each experiencing their own respective lives chapter by chapter, or how Sumio himself was actually Sumio Kodai from the Silver Case the entire time. After getting arrested by his best friend and colleague Kusabi in the previous game, poor bastard went into a dissociative escapist fugue, trying desperately to run away from his past, to perhaps lose that past. But if there's one thing for sure out of this series, is that the past was always meant to be killed. By the halfway point, there's so many winks and nods that it's simply impossible to deny that Flower, Sun, and Rain is not just a cool side entry to the franchise. Despite all the hurdles along the way, FSR has always been this pivotal piece of Kill the Past, and its contribution to the experience becomes nearly mandatory. Something that would be referenced even further by the addition of a free extra chapter at the end of the Silver Case, one that would connect both games through the medium of our perennial Turtle Boy. This epilogue effectively bridging the gap between both stories in a way that feels all too fitting for the series. Both Tokyo and Sumio ran away to temporarily avoid their problems instead of facing them head on, and both men end up having to deal with them in different ways. I can't help but fuck majorly with the sheer amount of creativity coming from Suda's design philosophy and the way he interconnected each major piece of the puzzle to the Silver Case. It's ballsy as fuck to release a game overseas without its prequel and just expect people to get it. But you know, sometimes that's just how things gotta be. The direction Suda chose for Flower, Sun, and Rain was admittedly a pretty big departure from his usual style. In doing so, you really get the impression that we're considering this game as an escape from reality, from the mundanity of day-to-day life. Though the more you play, the more you come to realize that maybe it's not that simple. One could see the game as an extension of Suda's career himself, and maybe the escape is talking more about conventional video game design and all of its shackles. Because after all, we're talking about a game that was released at a time where the medium was just starting to garner more of a critical look, instead of being instantly dismissed as toys for children. Suddenly, video games were a valid medium of expression, a vector for stories that would bring emotions into its players, which in turn gave rise to so many creators who wouldn't shy away from making the stuff I love so much nowadays. Despite the world often ridiculing them for their weird and avant-garde ideas, folks like Suda, amongst many other artists, instead took a step forward in order to preserve their self-expression. Because in the end, Flower, Sun, and Rain is a game about coming to terms with your past, to stop looking backwards and worrying all the time, so you can finally face tomorrow and fight for the future. I remember a time, not so long ago, where I was constantly worried about the way I presented myself, the way I wrote for videos like this, self-conscious to the point of paralysis. It's only really because of other artists, fellow creators, and inspirations that I started to appreciate what I do here. Flower, Sun, and Rain's dialogue can come off as unexpected, strange, or even overly dramatic to some folks. Suda consistently maintains his style throughout all that he's ever worked on, and it only got stronger throughout the years. A mishmash of eclectic ideas that has this very chaotic nature, though always in a controlled manner. Each character's dialogue is crafted in a consistent way, yet feels entirely unique, so much so that it's hard not to see some value in all of that weirdness. Because to be honest, style and substance always were one and the same. Suda's way of delivering dialogue without ever breaking the flow of a story is something I don't see a lot of folks talking about. It's always, oh, look how nonsensical the luchador on the rooftop is. But said luchador got something deep inside, yeah? El Soulfight talks in a distinct way, one that leaves a massive impression on anyone who plays through Flower, Sun, and Rain. His lines convey a certain pro-wrestling language, but it's not just for show. There's no wrestlers in Moonlight Syndrome, or even in The Silver Case, but there are tons of references to pro wrestling scattered all over Suda's writing, later even creating more characters who would take on heavy inspiration from that universe. If you go back though, you'll find that the man himself, while working at Human Entertainment, directed Super Fire Pro Wrestling 3 Final Bout for the Super Famicom. It's sort of his birthplace at this point. The scenario for that game's sequel, Super Fire Pro Wrestling Special, showed the protagonist reaching the point where he could finally become a wrestler, and then taking his own life. That was inspired by the unfortunate passing of Nirvana's Kurt Cobain, who not only had an enormous impact on the musical world, but also on Suda himself. Because despite being a game designer, his inspirations have always shined brightly wherever he goes, through his love of wrestling, of rock music, of everything that makes his work fundamentally his. It's all vital stuff to Suda's own style of expression, and in some way, it made me realize that there's no shame in having my own as well. I remember reading this translated article about him and the development of Flower, Sun, and Rain, comparing Suda to music critics and wrestling magazine editors and how he expressed himself. Their words coming off sometimes as confusing, or even messy for the uninitiated, but also being entirely unsurpassable in their knowledge of their respective domains. Their means of communication being pretty much passion itself. Suda's way of expressing himself does end up taking on that same thermal conductivity, in the way that inspires others around him to go out there and make all that weird noise you want to make. I've seen people describe his writing style as an overall attitude instead. And you know what? I can kinda see what they mean. It's infectious. It's what makes me want to get up and look at all those weird games and yap along for way too long about stuff that makes me me, stuff that makes me happy. Flower, Sun, and Rain, in all of its unconventional vibes, is much more than what it looked like initially. The scenery of Lost Pass Island might look like this paradise on Earth, but what does it really tell you? Even though it's a southern island, the airport serves as the symbol of globalization, of changing times. The mentality of the folks inhabiting the whole resort is expressed via this consumerist society, filled to the brim with perfectly designed advertisements ripped straight out of magazines. The whole guidebook you use throughout the story being a peak example for that. Whether or not Suda confirms or denies any of this, that's up to you to judge, to play through it and see for yourself. Because Flower, Sun, and Rain is not reflective of a desire to escape from reality, to escape from the past. The game, like every one of Suda's work, was created by diving into our current world and breathing in that modern air. It's a postmodern fiction that breaks the boundaries between realities and video game by disrupting reality throughout the game. While a lot of FSR's references to the past, specifically Suda's, might come off as just gratuitous fan service for the sake of patting the couple of diehard fans on the back, it's never quite like that. Just like how the Silver Case tied nicely the fate of the Moonlight Syndrome cast into one last goodbye, Flower, Sun, and Rain looks at the Silver Case very similarly. All the characters you learned to love and grew fond of finally get some form of closure, though never tied completely. Since both games acted as direct opposites both in gameplay and in design, here you get this beautiful open ending. In its meta look towards the past, it inherits the legacies of Moonlight Syndrome and the Silver Case and chooses to march forward, breaking through the past to fly into tomorrow. One where the flowers will always bloom, the sun will shine brightly, and the rain will continue to fall.